Okay, today's class, we want to introduce the whole subject of the English Bible. We want to introduce the main versions. And to understand the English Bible, we've got to understand the history of England. We have to understand the history of what's going on. Remember, between Tyndale's Bible in 1523 and the King James Bible of 1611, we're going to have 7 editions of the English Bible within a 90-year period. And to balance that out, from the King James coming on the scene in 1611, there's not another significant English Bible translation until the 1880s. And really, it's not until the late 1950s, early 1960s that other English translations begin to encroach significantly on what we might call the market share of the King James. So the King James Bible for 350 years it's the only Bible in town in England, but in the 90-year period before it, there's 7. So and one of the reasons, of course, is the tumultuous history of England at that time. Also the fact that not only was politics changing, but the English language is changing. When Tyndale produces his English Bible in 1523, English is still kind of late Middle English. It is the English out of the Middle Ages. It's a little bit more modern, but it is still a very old English. In fact, if you looked at a Tyndale Bible, if I gave you a printed Tyndale Bible, you might not be able to read it very well. The same thing with a King James in 1611. If you look at a 1611 edition, it's pretty difficult to read because English was different. And so from Tyndale then, in that era, 1523 to King James, you go from late Middle English, you sweep through Elizabethan English. Elizabethan English comes and goes. And then by the time you get to 1611, the King James, you're entering into modern English. You're beginning that whole era. So the whole English language is very dynamic at the time. And the translations reflect that. But to start, I want to look at the history of England at this moment. When Tyndale comes to begin his translation work in the 1520s, the guy that's on the throne is Henry VIII. Now, Henry VIII, we want to back up a little bit and talk about his father, because his father, Henry VII, was the first king in what they call the Tudor dynasty. If you ever watched the TV series The Tudors, Henry VII is the first king of England in that house of Tudor. And the entire Tudor dynasty is bound up in this era, because Henry VII is the first Tudor king. Elizabeth I is the last Tudor king, and the new house in England, the House of Stuart, comes into being with Elizabeth's successor, James I. And so an entire dynasty of England is going to also come and go during this time, along with the change of language, along with a religious change, which Henry VIII is going to oversee. And that religious change is England is going to shift from Catholicism to a form of Protestantism, to a very dynamic Protestantism for a very short amount of time, and then finally to a Protestantism that is more recognizable now in England under Elizabeth I, what we call the Anglicanism or the Church of England. But Henry VII lives from 1547 to 1509, and we know him in current events because Henry VII is the guy who defeated the former king, Richard III. Now, Richard III is infamously notorious in English history, and his body was just discovered. He was buried under a parking lot. And they were excavating and doing work, and they found some skeletal remains, and it turns out that conclusively now demonstrated that this is Richard III, the last king before really the modern era of English monarchs, which begins with Henry VII. So Richard is defeated in battle. He is deposed by Henry VII, and his son, Henry VIII. Henry VIII is born in 1491, and he will live until 1547. He will reign from 1509, when his father dies, until 1547. So he comes to the throne relatively young, and he will bring a lot of changes to England. He will really just basically change everything. Henry VIII, we remember Henry VIII mainly from his wives. We see pictures of Henry VIII. We remember him as kind of fat, kind of given over to his own lusts, as it were. And in his later life, that's kind of who he is. But he's much more than that. Henry VIII really brings the Renaissance into England. His father had been warring and battling and never really got to do a lot in terms of establishing the culture of England. Henry VIII will really do that. And Henry VIII is really a Renaissance man. He is a writer. He is a composer of music. He is a patron of the arts. And like many people of that ilk, Henry VII, his father, was very, very frugal with his money, and Henry VIII comes into the kingdom with a huge fortune. Unfortunately, he spent it all on stuff, and by the time he dies, his son Edward VI comes in, and England is in debt to the tune of 400,000 pounds, which in that era is a lot of money. So Henry was an interesting guy. Now, Henry VIII does several things. As he comes to reign and comes into really the maturity of his reign, he sees a couple of things going on. First of all, he sees that England, as part of the larger Catholic theocracy in Europe, was really under the control of the Pope. And the popes were obviously ruling in Italy, and Henry had a kind of animosity towards them anyway. And as his life progressed, and he has reasons to dislike the popes even more, he still always has this idea of being very English. He wanted England to rule England, and he wanted everyone in England to understand that he was the king, and he didn't serve anybody. He served the interests of England. He really insinuates this very nationalistic spirit into English society. But he was very Catholic. Henry is alive and reigning when Luther is posting his 95 Theses. When Luther is writing his works against Catholicism, as the Protestant Reformation is beginning, Henry VIII is the monarch. And it's interesting because as Luther is in Germany writing against Catholicism, as he is warring, as it were, against the Pope, Henry VIII comes to the Pope's aid. And he doesn't do it with an army, he doesn't do it militarily, he does it literary. He writes a book. In 1521, Henry writes a book called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. The Defense of the Seven Sacraments is Henry's response to Martin Luther and Luther's Reformation. And in many, many ways, it's probably the most significant defense of Catholicism that was produced. In other words, whereas the Pope and his entourage in Rome and the Vatican were largely trying to suppress Luther by force of arms, by decree, by court, by executions, by pursuing him, Henry VIII, as more of a Renaissance, as a thinker, he realized that Catholicism, to survive, needed to defeat the Reformation intellectually. It had to defeat them by appealing to the people and appealing to their thinking process. He was a man of that era. And so he writes the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. It is widely popular. It is very influential in helping literate Catholics defend Catholicism against the Reformation, and in many ways it was reasonably successful. And in fact, as a reward, the Pope grants Henry VIII the title Defender of the Faith. And as you see the all of the titles that the English monarch has now, the chief title that they retain is Defender of the Faith. And that was because it was a title given to Henry VIII by the Pope, and it's a title that the English monarchs have retained ever since, and they and keep it that way. And so Henry is very, very important, an intellectual guy, a writer, and but somebody who is very, very English. And he's the king. He wants to keep being the king, and he wants to expand his power. And he eventually came to see the papacy as an impediment to his power. Now, part of the problem, of course, was as he is getting older, as he's getting into, he does marry several times, and his first wife is simply not able to give him the son that he wanted. He was married to Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon was Spanish, and with Catherine, he has a child who will come back later, and the child is Mary the First, who will reign after. Eventually, we'll get to her a little bit. She's going to reign a little bit later, but she will also be married. She will marry Philip, who's the king of Spain, and for a time, Spain dominates England, and which didn't play very well later on, but we'll talk about that. But when Catherine was not able to produce a male heir, he works and he has a couple of options. He could just let it go. He could get rid of Catherine and marry someone else, or he could work and maneuver to change the laws of succession so his family would stay in power. He chose the idea of getting rid of Catherine and then marrying again. And he does, and he marries, removes Catherine and marries Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn will be important because she'll be the mother of Elizabeth, who will eventually reign also after her sister. So it gets a little complicated in understanding. But Anne Boleyn, they don't have a son. Finally, finally, he goes through enough wives, and he finally gets a son, and that son is Edward. Now, working through all of that, what he does is he slowly begins to separate himself from the Catholic Church, because eventually the Pope won't sanction getting rid, because the Pope was afraid really of upsetting the other continental powers, Spain and France particularly, who were largely Catholic, dominantly Catholic, and very powerful within that. And the Pope understood that he only retained power as long as these individual kings supported him. And so he became reluctant to go along with Henry. Remember, Britain is an emerging power, but it isn't the world power that it will become. At this time, when Henry comes to the throne, Spain is the world power. Spain is the dominant world power, and that's who the Pope really kind of has to appease and keep the Spanish Empire happy. Henry begins a series of acts and laws that are passed that establishes himself as the head of the church. In 1534, they issue the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy of 1534 makes the monarch, the supreme ruler of the church in England, not the Pope. And there was another act right after that in 1535, which made it high treason, punishable by death, to assert that the Pope had authority over the king in ecclesiastical matters in England. And so they took this really, really seriously. The biggest thing that Henry does, and the thing that the Catholic Church never recovers from in England, although there will be a Catholic Renaissance after Henry's death, the thing that Henry does that pretty systematically destroys the Catholic Church and destroys their power in England is between 1536 and 1541, you have the dissolution of the monasteries. And all of the English monasteries, all the Catholic monasteries in England are dissolved. The church's property is seized, and Henry takes that property and redistributes it to his friends, to the landlords, to the nobles of the land, and he's able then to obviously get their support, because Henry enriches a huge layer of the nobility in England, because the church doesn't have this property anymore. The nobles have it, so it becomes their property. They get the farming rights, they get the money, they get the taxation, all of that goes there. And England also, under Henry during this era, stops paying taxes to Rome. So the flow of money from England to Rome through the Catholic Church ends. And Henry forbids money to be sent to Rome in the form of taxation. So all English money now is going to stay within England, which is going to, in theory, spur the economy along, but because Henry overspent, it's going to take a while. Henry is the guy who also, when Henry becomes king, we're talking about England as a world power, when Henry becomes king, the British Navy had 5 ships. Henry is really also the father of the modern British Navy. During his reign, the Navy will increase from 5 ships to 84. And then ultimately it will continue to grow, and by the time of Nelson and the Napoleonic Wars, the British Navy is nearly 1,000 ships. So so Henry starts that, and Henry goes on. And he was important in ecclesiastical affairs. In 1545, he issues his own catechism, which replaces the catechism of the Catholic Church, and it's called Henry's Catechism, and it's kind of the foundation of what will be going on. So Henry moves from Catholicism to a form of Protestantism. He never buys into everything Luther wanted theologically. He really did like the theology of the Catholic Church and the 7 sacraments. He really never abandons a lot of those things. What he wants to get rid of, and what he does get rid of in England, is the dominance of the hierarchy. The hierarchy will, instead of going to the Pope, the hierarchy is going to stop with him. The king is in charge, and in terms of the church structure, you have the king, you have his Archbishop of Canterbury, who's the leader of the head bishop of England, and then the Archbishop of York will be the number 2. And it really continues to that day. In England today, the Archbishop of Canterbury is nominated by the monarch, in this case the Queen, who just is going to be in the process of nominating a new Archbishop of Canterbury, and then Parliament affirms that. The monarch appoints, Parliament affirms, and then the new Archbishop will run the Church of England, and although the monarch is still in title over the Church of England. The Archbishop is appointed by the King or the Queen. So Henry begins a significant amount of work. Now, under Henry, of the 7 English Bibles, 4 of them are going to come into existence under his reign. The Tyndale Bible of 1523, the Coverdale Bible of 1535, the Matthews Bible of 1537, and then the Great Bible of 1539. And we'll talk about those Bibles in a second, but just, you can see how Henry dominates this era. Everything changes. England moves from an important but not a significant military presence to the second largest navy in Europe. Henry VIII will see lots of changes in the structure. He really sets up the modern English monarchy and the modern structure that will dominate England really up through World War II. And then establishes, he's over Parliament, but Parliament does have a lot of power. And Parliament's power is going to be emerging and eventually come into conflict with the monarchy. We'll see that in a second. Any questions so far? Are we doing okay? Okay. After Henry VIII, Henry VIII is injured in a jousting tournament later in life, which is one of the reasons he gains a lot of weight. He can't exercise. He was, in his youth, a very robust, athletic guy, horse rider, jouster, participant in sports and things like that. After he was injured, he didn't do as much, and he also became ill, and he gained a lot of weight, which wasn't from overeating as much as he had disease which caused him to gain a lot of weight. Henry finally, with Anne Boleyn, has a son. Or with Jane Seymour, excuse me, has a son, and the son is Edward, who will become Edward VI. Edward VI is born in 1537. He will only live until 1553. When Henry dies in 1547, Edward is 10 years old and becomes king. He reigns through what they call a regency council. In other words, there is a council of nobles who actually run everything for him in the king's name until the king is of age, which was either 16 or 18, depending on the era. And the king moves into what is called his majority, when he can now be the absolute monarch, and he no longer is required by law to have a regency council to run the affairs of state for him. Although everything is done in Edward's name. That's how the system would work. Under Edward VI, or during Edward VI's reign, Thomas Cranmer will be the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas Cranmer, more than anyone else, brings the Reformation into England. Cranmer is a thoroughgoing convert to Protestantism, and drives the theology of the late reign of Henry VIII and all of Edward VI. He's really the theological and ecclesiological power behind the throne under Edward. Cranmer does two things. He creates two things. First of all, Cranmer is the author of the Book of Common Prayer. The Book of Common Prayer in 1548 is his creation, and next to the King James Bible, in terms of English church life, the Book of Common Prayer is the most recognizable part of English church life. I mean, there were people who would carry the Book of Common Prayer to church instead of the Bible. By the time, when you see a lot of old English translation, even King James Bibles, you'll often see a King James Bible bound, your Old Testament, your New Testament, and the Book of Common Prayer. And the way printing would work at that time, a person would go to the printer and order a Bible. They want a Bible, and you'd have a New Testament, you'd have an Old Testament, you have different things you could add to it. And a lot of Bibles you'll find, even King James, you'll find the first thing in it is the Book of Common Prayer, then the Old Testament and New Testament. Sometimes you'll see the Book of Common Prayer at the end. Sometimes it'll be bound between the Old and New Testament. But Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer is massively important. It is really what the Church of England is for many, many centuries. Although completed and adopted after he dies, Cranmer was responsible for also writing a document called the 39 Articles. The 39 Articles would be adopted finally in 1563. But the 39 Articles are the doctrinal statement of the Church of England. They'll be modified over the years a few times, but under Cranmer's edition, they are relatively Calvinistic. They are very, very thoroughly Reformed and thoroughly Protestant. Elizabeth will modify them later in her reign, but they form the basis of the modern Church of England. They are the theological basis and they are what Edward wanted. Edward, despite his youth, Edward was the first English monarch raised as a Protestant, educated as a Protestant, thoroughgoingly Protestant in his upbringing. And although he doesn't live very long, he is a very spiritually minded kid. He was very involved in that part of the process. Even though he was still governed by a regency council, he still involved himself and still was getting involved in the Protestant inculcation of England in all of the things that were going on. So Edward sometimes he's kind of skipped over as relatively unimportant because he doesn't reign very long and he never reigns as an adult. But that's kind of to play him short a little bit. He does exert a little bit of influence, even despite only being a teenager, in the emerging Protestant movement. Now, the problem with the emerging Church of England, the emerging Protestant movement, the problem is Edward is never a healthy boy. He's never in good health at all. They're worried he's going to die. And the problem is that if he dies, the next in line to the throne, although they had been written out of the succession, Edward had no heir, and the legitimate claimants to the throne were his half-sister Mary and his other half-sister Elizabeth, who were daughters of Catherine of Aragon again, and Elizabeth, who is the daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII. And they've been kind of excluded and sent off, and they're been cut out during Edward's reign. But they know that if Edward dies without an heir, a legitimate heir, that one of these two could come back in and upset what was going on. And that's exactly what happened. Edward VI was scheduled to be married. They had found a healthy woman who was older than him, but the hope was that he would be able to have an heir. And at that point, they weren't really particular if it was a boy or a girl. They just needed a healthy, legitimate heir from Edward VI. And so, all things going on, he was going to be married to a young English noblewoman with the hope of producing a son or a daughter. Unfortunately, Edward became ill again, and it was obvious that this ill was terminal. And so Edward, trying to, and his counselors trying to keep the Protestant legitimacy going, Edward appointed Lady Jane Grey, the one woman that he probably was going to be, married to, appointed her queen upon his death. Lady Jane Grey reigns for 9 days. It was badly calculated by the leaders of his Regency Council. It wasn't well done. It didn't work. It was not a popular move. They didn't have the wide support that they needed among the nobles, and the English were the English, one thing they didn't like, they didn't like being manipulated behind the scenes. And they a king, understand, the monarchy is viewed as from God. The monarch is God's representative. The monarch is God's governor on earth over the kingdom. And the people really believe that. They are really, really wed to that concept, and to tinker with the monarchy, to manipulate it that way, even though they might have been popular, the Protestants might have been popular, they might have been in power, they might have, had kind of the ear of the people still saw it for what it was, and they didn't like it, and ultimately, Lady Jane Grey, whether or not she was ever actually, she's, depending on which history you read, is she actually a monarch or not? She never is actually installed and never does anything, and she's only queen for 9 days. Well, the supporters of Edward's half-sister Mary are able to win the day. Lady Jane Grey is ultimately executed, and so are her supporters. And Mary I comes to the throne. Mary I is born in 1516, and she dies in 1558. She reigns from 1553 to 1558, so she only reigns for 5 years, and that's largely very fortunate. She is known in history as Bloody Mary. Mary, again, was the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife. Mary essentially lives in exile. She lives growing over the years of significant embitterment. She comes to hate her father, Henry VIII, hates the way her mother was treated and ultimately executed, hates everything about the Reformation, hates everything about Protestantism, is thoroughgoingly Catholic, and is Spanish. Remember, her mother is Spanish. She marries Philip, who is Prince of Spain, and then when Philip becomes king, she is Philip is the King of Spain, married now to the Queen of England. And so Philip exercises a significant amount of influence in England, but never takes over. Mary is still the queen. Mary, being thoroughly Catholic, also has an ally and brings in Reginald Pole, Pole. And Pole is appointed Archbishop of Canterbury. And he is the last Catholic to serve in that position. And Mary and Reginald Pole, who are also purported to be lovers, will bring in a resurgence of Catholicism back into England. Protestants either flee or they are killed. Mary's persecution of the Protestants is so severe and so bloody that she even upsets the Catholics. She is simply out for revenge, and seeking revenge and seeking to reestablish the Pope and the Catholic Church over the affairs of England. And in so doing, she miscalculates England very badly. And as a result, when she dies in 1558, Catholicism never comes back into England in a significant way. And in fact, so abusive were things under Mary and under Reginald Pole that when they die, and they die within a couple of weeks of each other. Mary dies, and Reginald Pole dies shortly thereafter. I mean, within a very short time of each other. And when they both die, Catholicism is really suppressed because they had because of the abuses of the Catholic Church. They were what every Protestant was saying would happen if the Catholics came back. These bad things are going to happen, and Mary exemplified all of those things. She called together a group of Protestant pastors in England on the pretense of meeting and talking it out and trying to work together so everyone in England could kind of get along. But it was a ruse. She called them all together, surrounded them, and had them all executed. And this was beyond the pale. This was really the end of Catholic, and England remembered that for centuries, and Catholicism was repressed in England for centuries afterwards. You simply could not, you couldn't be the prime minister. You still can't be Catholic and be the prime minister of England. You have to be, if you were not a member of the Church of England, you simply did not rise in society. And if you were Catholic, you simply were not going to advance in government or the hierarchy or military service or anything like that. Mary was thought to be pregnant, but she wasn't, and ultimately she dies in 1558. Reginald Pole dies immediately thereafter, and the next in line is Elizabeth the First, who is Mary and Edward's last sibling, the last living child of Henry VIII. Elizabeth will reign from 1558 to 1603. So a 40-plus year reign. Depending on what you read about Elizabeth, Elizabeth is either revered as a great queen. Some historians will simply say she was very lucky. She was exceptionally bright. She was a scholar in her own right. And we'll talk about two of the Bibles are going to come into existence during her reign. The Geneva Bible, which she has nothing to do with, but also doesn't dislike, contrary to common notion. But the Bishop's Bible in 1568 will also be produced. And many think that the Bishop's Bible is never actually officially sanctioned by Elizabeth to be exclusively read in the churches. She still allowed the Geneva Bible in theory to be printed. And one of the reasons people believe that the Bishop's Bible was never officially sanctioned by her was she recognized the scholarship of the Bishop's Bible was inferior to the Geneva. But be as it may, she was a very bright, very astute leader. She was her father's daughter in many, many ways. She was politically astute. She was able to form alliances, able to keep the nobles, and she was able to build off, and because she believed in it too, a British nationalism. The Brits and the English at this time were very upset with Mary, not only because of the abuses of her Catholic repression, but also because they began to view Mary as a traitor that was about to give England to Spain. And the nationalism that Henry VIII had built, and then the love of England and the supremacy of England and the idea of English nationalism that built under Henry VIII, which had been suppressed by Mary, Elizabeth took that and ran with it. And under Elizabeth, the empire is secured. She was a moderate Protestant. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been Protestant. And as a result, she began to undo almost immediately everything that Mary had done, and again got rid of the Catholic Church. Again, the act of supremacy under her reign. She was the supreme leader of the church in England. And because of that, in 1570, the Pope declared her to be illegitimate. There always was a question about her legitimacy in the English court, whether or not she really was. Were Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII actually married when she was born? And so there was always some issue about that. In 1570, the Pope declared her to be illegitimate and thus released all English subjects from obeying her. Well, that didn't work. And Elizabeth firmed up her rule, and the Catholic Church then was essentially done. The Catholic Church then had to resort to, through their other Catholic nations, Spain being the chief among them, and the Spanish Empire went to war with England. And if you remember the history, Spain attempts to conquer England, but in 1588, Spain is utterly defeated in the Battle of the Spanish Armada. And in that battle in 1588, the Spanish Empire is crippled, and it never recovers. The Spanish naval power is virtually destroyed. The English Navy from 1588 moving forward is the dominant navy of the world, unquestioned. The battle of the Spanish Armada and their defeat completely secures England as the dominant world power and the dominant colonial power of the world going forward. Now they'll build that. It'll take some time, but England is never again seriously challenged. Now, one of the other things that helps, you always wonder, how does England emerge out as the dominant European power? Well, remember, all of the wars that have been going on had all been on the continent. The English countryside, the English infrastructure, and that island remained intact. They sent troops to go fight in the wars in Europe, but they never actually fought on English soil. So while Europe is being decimated by wars year after year after year, England is able to prosper. The same principle applies really to the United States. You have World War I. You have the really after the Civil War, the United States is never involved in destruction on this continent. Not until you have the attack on Pearl Harbor, which is in World War II, which is in Hawaii, but it's not really on the continental United States. You don't have a significant attack on the continental United States until 9/11, when you have the terrorists crashing the airplanes and killing the people in New York and D.C. and Pennsylvania. I mean, that's how isolated the United States becomes from war itself, because the United States there's two oceans between it and every other world power. It's just impossible to attack that way. So but England was the same way. To cross the English Channel, it just simply couldn't be done. I mean, even in World War II, Germany wasn't able to pull it off. Napoleon was not able to cross the Channel and invade England. It became too difficult. And so England's infrastructure remains untouched and is able to continue to grow and prosper. Elizabeth I, again, a moderate Protestant, but she establishes the modern Church of England. It is the sometimes called the Via Media, the Church of the Middle Way. Elizabeth did not like controversy. She understood the theological issues. She just didn't care for them. She came to dislike the Protestants, the Puritans especially, and the Pilgrims who had come to America, and the Puritans, because she viewed them as extremists. The extreme Calvinists she did not like. And under her revision of the 39 Articles, Calvinism was kind of removed from the 39 Articles, and it was made a more moderate document. And Elizabeth tried to get everybody to do the same thing. So you had the Act of Uniformity, which ministers had to do this, and they had to follow the Book of Common Prayer. In other words, if you were a pastor in that era, under Elizabeth, you didn't, what should I preach on this week? It's in the Book of Common Prayer. The text for your week is there, and that's what you preach on. You wouldn't, on Sunday, in other words, on Sunday, every church in England, every pastor is preaching on the same text. And so there was, and they liked that. They liked that uniformity of worship. They liked everyone kind of being on the same page, which is why they needed an English Bible to be uniform. Now, one of the things that Elizabeth will do during this time is she will begin to interfere and ultimately lay the groundwork for England and Scotland being unified. In Scotland, the Reformation was going full blast. And John Knox and Presbyterianism in Scotland will take over. And as a result, the Queen of Scotland is Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots is then forced to abdicate. And she goes to Elizabeth thinking Elizabeth will assist her. Elizabeth is suspicious of Catholicism. Mary was very Catholic, but nothing like Mary of England. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Catholic. She was reasonably well liked. She was a moderate sort of Catholic. She didn't want to impose it, but she was Catholic. And ultimately, Elizabeth indirectly causes Mary, Queen of Scots, to be tried and executed. And she had been earlier forced to abdicate in favor of her son, who had been raised a Protestant, who was become James VI of Scotland. Now hang on, this gets confusing, but hang with me. In 1603, Elizabeth dies. One of the nicknames of Queen Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. Not because she was, but because she never married and never had any children. And so Elizabeth dies, as they say, without issue. She dies without an heir. And as a result, they need a new monarch. And they go looking around, and they decide that the Parliament decides the monarch should be James VI of Scotland. James VI was related to the Tudor line. There was a connection there. And remember, in Europe and England and all that area, the monarchs are all related to each other. Remember, one of the fascinating issues of World War I is you have the king of England, Tsar of Russia, and the Kaiser of Germany, and they're all first cousins. They are all related to each other through Queen Victoria's children. And if you add the Romania and Bulgaria and Italy and lots of other little countries, all the monarchs are related to each other because they tended to marry within the royalty, and they tended to form allegiances that way as well. I think I'm trying to remember now, but I think even in Norway, the king of Norway, I think William is second in line to be king of England after his father Charles, but he's also like sixth in line to become king of Norway because of the way everything works. And so it's a very interesting deal. And so they go to and they decide that James VI of Scotland should be king. And so he is made king. So James VI of Scotland in 1603 becomes James I of England. And the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of Scotland are unified. King James, James I, born in 1566, dies in 1625. He was called the wisest fool in Christendom. He was an interesting character, to say the least. He was king of Scotland Scotland was run by the Presbyterian. The state church of Scotland was the Presbyterian church. It was what the Church of England was, but it was the Church of Scotland, and it was Presbyterian. It was run on Presbyterian principles. John Knox had brought it into existence. John Knox, whom Elizabeth I despised, and everything about what was going on up there. But it just worked out that way. James I comes to England, and as he's going to become monarch, the Puritans, the Protestants, the Calvinistic reformers in England, the Puritans, thought that this was their moment. And so they present James I a list of petitions. Get rid of the Church of England and make it Presbyterian. There's a laundry list of things the Puritans want. And James I convenes the Hampton Court Conference to talk about this stuff. Well, James I liked being king. and he disliked the Presbyterian system. He was Protestant, but he disliked the Presbyterian system. And James' first answer to the Puritans was, no bishop, no monarch. And what James understood was that Presbyterianism, that church, that form of church government, brought into a national system like the national system of Scotland, eventually was going to lead to the removal of the monarch. And he saw that, and he didn't like that idea. And so he said no. And basically the Puritans' laundry list of things they wanted that they presented to the king, that came up at the Hampton Court Conference, he didn't get anything. Except one thing. They got the king to authorize the creation of a New English version of the Bible. And it became known as the King James Bible. It would be produced in 1611. The King James Bible was the one thing James was agreeable to. Now, the reasons he was agreeable to it were political. Scotland had been dominated by the Geneva Bible and the notes of the Geneva Bible. The notes of the Geneva Bible tended to be very, very anti-monarchical and anti-king, but anti-king in such a way of a Anglican king or a Catholic king. The Puritans were not against having a king, but they wanted their kind of king. They didn't mind someone with the power of the monarchy, but they wanted their monarch. So when you have, and this kind of, because during this time, what else is going on? The colonialization of North America. And remember, you've heard the stories. You know the Pilgrims who came to escape persecution, which was true, to establish religious freedom in the colonies, which wasn't true. And all the colonies were different. The Massachusetts colonies, which were Puritan, which were trying to, they wanted religious freedom for themselves. When you talk about the colonies now, when you talk about the Puritans coming, the Pilgrims who come first, and then the Puritans, all Pilgrims are Puritans, but not all Puritans are Pilgrims. It's kind of how it goes. And as that begins to move out, in the New World, in North America, Massachusetts, that area, New York, Philadelphia, they wanted religious freedom for them. That wasn't included to anybody else. They wanted their version of Calvinistic theocracy. And so that's what was coming over. And other colonies were started, you have Rhode Island that has started. Rhode Island is really the only true colony that believed in pluralism, in religious pluralism. In other words, that's why Rhode Island tended to be the center of where Baptists, Brown University in Rhode Island was a Baptist school, and it starts there. There are a large number of Quakers who are also live in Rhode Island. The great general of the American Revolution, Nathaniel Greene, who was a Quaker who renounced pacifism and became, Washington hoped that Nathaniel Greene would take over for him if anything happened to him, and wins the southern battles of the American Revolution. And he was from Rhode Island. Pennsylvania was obviously Quaker in its origination. It was a colony. William Penn and it was Quaker dominated that area of Pennsylvania. But New York, Massachusetts were all dominantly Puritan, Calvinistic, Reform theology. Virginia was the name after Elizabeth, but was Anglican largely. In different states and different colonies were different religious affiliations. So it's kind of a mixture, but they were very, very exclusive. The Quakers weren't interested in the Calvinists. The Anglicans weren't interested in either. And so when you came over, you might get off the boat in New York, but depending on who you were and where you wanted to be safe, you went here or there. And so that's also going on during this era as well. The New World is beginning to emerge. And the Bible of the New World, the Bible of the Mayflower and the early colonists is the Geneva Bible, until the King James comes in and begins to supplant that early on. Although the King James is not a popular, because James wasn't particularly, he was very popular with the people, but he wasn't well liked. And in his version of the Bible, the King James version of the Bible, it took probably about 40 to 50 years for it to really take over from the Geneva. But the reason it did was the English was modern now. The Geneva Bible was even becoming dated in terms of its English usage, even in that short time, because English was changing so rapidly. And finally, by 1650, the Geneva Bible is not printed anymore. It goes out of existence. James lives until 1625, and just to kind of continue the story, James is the first of the House of Stuart. The House of Stuart will not have a happy, long life. James will die in 1625. He will be succeeded by his son, Charles I. Charles will live from 1600 to 1649, and he will reign from 1625 to 1649. Charles I is executed by Cromwell, and the Republic, the English Republic under Cromwell, or the Protectorate as Cromwell called it, comes into power, and the monarchy is abolished until 1660. So from basically about 11 years, Cromwell will rule. In 1660, the monarchy is restored, and Charles II will come to power. Charles II is inept by anyone's standard. He is widely disliked. He had spent most of his life trying to become king again and reestablish the monarchy. And when it finally is reestablished and he is brought in, people, it's the old saying, be careful what you wish for. And they get Charles II, and they kind of wish they hadn't. Finally, he is he's overthrown, and then you have in England called the Glorious Revolution, where the monarchy is not gotten rid of, but they get brand new monarchs. And they go get William and Mary. William and Mary are German. And because you have to have a monarch, you need something. There was some vague connection, and Parliament brought William and Mary in, and William and Mary were put on the throne, and they were established as the new King of England, and that is the house that remains to this day. The descendants of William and Mary, their line is still on the throne in the current Queen Elizabeth II. So it's interesting because right after that, their son, who will be George, not their immediate son, but their grandson, George III, who is the king during the American Revolution. He doesn't speak very good English. It won't be until George's son, George IV, that you have the royal family actually really speaking good English. George was much better in German. He spoke German most of the time. And so you have that going on. Questions about that? Does that make sense? Now, in all of that, just to kind of give you the background, this is a tumultuous time in England. Lots of things are changing. And into that comes these different editions of the English Bible. And I just want to go now that we've been through the kings and queens, I want to kind of go through the 7 English Bibles real quick, give you a quick synopsis of them and where they fit in. Remember, 4 of them are under Henry VIII. The first one that comes, that we count as really the first one, is the Tyndale Bible. And really the Tyndale New Testament. One of the things that you'll be interested in, and we'll be having this at Shepherd's Conference, I think, in 2 weeks. We have acquired a Tyndale New Testament, and so it's going to be on display here at Shepherd's Conference, and then displayed here on in our Bible room upstairs. So we'll be able. Sometime before the semester's over, I'll be able to bring that to class, and we'll take a look at it and show you a real. It's a reprint. It's a reprint, 1550 edition of the Tyndale New Testament. Tyndale lived from 1494 to 1536, and he wanted to produce an English Bible. And he had approached all of the channels and had done everything he was supposed to do, and he'd approached the Bishop of London to get permission. He needed ecclesiastical permission to produce a Bible in the English language. And basically the Bishop of London kept saying, yeah, well, we'll get around to that, and they never did. And so Tyndale finally became an outlaw and produced an English version of the Bible. He was strongly opposed by the church, and he was strongly opposed by Henry VIII. Henry hadn't broken with the church yet. And Tyndale was a remarkable guy. He was very much a scholar and very much English. He had a great command of the English language. And he understood the English language as the people use the English language. And he translated it as such. And you say, well, wasn't the first English Bible Wycliffe's Bible in the 1300s? Technically, yes. Wycliffe, though, only translates the Latin Vulgate into English. And it's honestly, even English of that era, it's not very good. Wycliffe is kind of the beginning of the Reformation in England, but he's executed. It doesn't work out for him. It never takes hold. And Wycliffe, his place in the history of the English Bible is more inspirational than it is really influence in terms of his translation theory or anything else, because he doesn't translate the Greek and Hebrew. He translates the Latin into English. Tyndale translates the Greek and a little bit of the Hebrew. Although he never completes the entire Bible. He mainly completes the New Testament, mainly completes the Gospels. But he did some fascinating things. He thoroughly became Protestant. And some of the things that he changed in terms of the wording, in terms of the translation, was instead of translating the word church, he translated it congregation, which is a huge change in terms of how are you going to read the English text. Instead of seeing church, this and that or the other, it was congregation. It was localized instead of the large ecclesiastical body. He changed the translation in the New Testament. He didn't translate it priest, he translated elder. Although in the first edition he used the word senior but he no longer translated it priest. So he was eliminating a religious classification. Remember, one of the office that the Catholic Church eliminates rather quickly early on in early church history, one of the things that departs from the church is the office of elder. And even under Constantine, the bishops begin to take over. They are the dominant church office. Local church elders, that office really goes away until the Reformation. And Tyndale translates the word elder. He translates the phrase do penance more properly as repent. Well, that's theological heresy. The idea of penance now has been removed from the translation. Again, this is how the church retained power in many respects, was control of the Bible. And he translates the word charity, he changes it to love. So his translation into English is important because it not only goes into the vernacular language, but there are words now that he's translating more accurately from the Greek text into words that have theological meaning. We're eliminating penance, to repent. In other words, the idea of doing penance and the idea of repenting are two different things entirely. And when people read their Bibles before Tyndale, the text said, do penance. Tyndale saying in that Bible and going forward now, it's going to be repent. So these are two different things. We're talking about, instead of the priests, to the priests at Philippi, to the elders at Philippi. And so the ecclesiastical structure is being changed by understanding the text correctly. The idea of charity, which is a good word, there's nothing wrong with charity, but changing that to love in the context of reading different texts where that is the appropriate word changes everything in terms of changing things from a works. Because to do charity is a good thing, but it is still an outward work. It's an important, in the Catholic system, to do charity is an important concept. In Protestantism, it is an important concept, but it doesn't save. It doesn't make you more holy to do good deeds, to do charity. When you change charity to love, you change it from an external act to an internal quality of character. And that's what Tyndale was trying to get across, and appropriately translating the text. The next Bible to come along is the Coverdale Bible. Miles Coverdale lives from 1488 to 1569, and he also, Miles Coverdale is an interesting guy. He kind of has a long history, and he's involved even working up to the King James. The Coverdale Bible was largely Tyndale's work, the New Testament, the Pentateuch, and probably Jonah, and Coverdale completed the Old Testament. The only problem was Coverdale didn't read Hebrew. And so Coverdale's Old Testament is a translation of Luther's German Bible into English. But it was the best he could do. Matthew's Bible, which was a pseudonym by John Rogers. You'll often see it referred to as Rogers' Bible. John Rogers, 1500 to 1555, he used the pseudonym Thomas Matthews to hide his identity. The Matthews Bible was approved by Henry VIII to be used in the churches, because by this time he had really broken with the Catholic Church, and he wanted an English version of the Bible to use to establish what he was doing in the churches. He wanted the churches to become English, and he was separating it from its Latin roots, the Latin Bible, the Latin phraseology. Henry VIII had passed laws that the services were to be done in English, the rituals were to be done in English, and so he did that, and he approved the Matthew's Bible because Henry VIII had also instigated the creation of his own English translation called the Great Bible. Now, the Great Bible would come out in 1539, before Henry dies, and it was really the first authorized Bible. Interestingly enough, the person who oversaw the creation of the Great Bible was our friend Miles Coverdale again. He kind of pops up here and there. It's also known as the Whitchurch Bible or the Chained Bible because it often was attached to the pulpit in front of the church, a large Bible. And the idea of a chained Bible gets kind of a bad reputation. I mean, it's not so much that it was chained so the people couldn't get it. There's chains. These things are valuable. You had to be a person of money to have a Bible in the first place. They were very, very expensive. Even with printing, they were still expensive. And so you didn't just leave it unchained in the church at night because the problem is someone would steal it. And they weren't easily kept. And so it's also called Cromwell because Cromwell oversaw with Coverdale the translation work. So it was actually, in places it was well done, in places it was awful. The problem was Henry, by the end of his reign, decreed that the Bible could only be read in church. What happened was the Great Bible was actually popular, and Henry's reforms were popular. And the Bible was being read and it was being understood in English. One of the funny things that happens, though, is that popular songs began to be created with phrases out of the Bible. And this infuriated Henry because Henry was a very religious guy. He really, in many respects, was much more devout than people give him credit for. And the idea that the common people would be just walking down the street singing what would then be called contemporary Christian music just drove him crazy. And so he says, no, this is gay. We can't have this. This is irreverent. And so Henry said, no, the Bible can only be read in church. And also the marginal notations that were in the Great Bible, he started having those blacked out that would give different readings and things like that. One of the problem of the Great Bible was that in that era in church, the Psalms were sung, and some churches still do that even today. They're sung in church. The Great Bible translation of the Psalms was awful, and they were unlyrical. They were one bishop said that the problem with the Psalms in the Great Bible is they're unsingable, and so they weren't well. The Old Testament was not well translated. And so they had a problem with that, and so the Great Bible was the deal. Shortly before he died, Henry decreed that only the Great Bible could be used and could be owned. And so right before Henry dies, lots of the previous Bibles, Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthews, were destroyed, which is why there are so few of them. Besides the Tyndale, we have a Coverdale in our collection. We're getting a Matthews, and that will be here as well. And we have a great Bible that you'll be able to see an original. Just talk about the Geneva Bible for a second because it is important, but it's kind of outside of England. The Reformers, the Puritans, Calvin, and his followers, they had an English group, and they produced an English Bible called the Geneva Bible in 1560. Now, the Geneva Bible is important because it is the first Bible. The Old Testament is translated from the Hebrew. The New Testament is translated from the Greek. It is very well done. And it's superior in terms of translation to anything that existed up to that point. Again, accounting for the fact that English is changing still. The Geneva Bible was produced in what we call a smaller size, but it was produced in such a way that an individual could pick it up and carry it to church and use it. It had lots of notations. The Geneva Bible was really the first study Bible. And it was important in that regard. And we're going to talk more next week about the Geneva Bible and its influence. But we're running out of time, so we need to get to the next Bible. And the next Bible under Queen Elizabeth is the Bishop's Bible. The Bishop's Bible of 1568, and the Geneva Bible was popular. It was well done, but Elizabeth and her Archbishop, Matthew Parker, did not like the notations. They didn't like the hard Calvinistic bent of the notations and the interpretations in the Bible. So Queen Elizabeth authorized the production of the Bishop's Bible. Matthew Parker, who had been her tutor, Elizabeth's mother had commended, had given the care of Elizabeth over to Matthew Parker. And so Matthew Parker was somebody she knew, she trusted. He was a moderate sort of guy, and he was reliable. Matthew Parker sort of moved from very much in favor of the Puritans to very much not in favor of the Puritans by the end of his life. He began to distrust their stridency and their desire to really take over government and affairs, and that their way, the Calvinistic way, was the only way. And Parker really rebelled against that. But Parker does a lot of things well. He uses a committee to translate his Bible, which is the first time that's done. All of the Bibles previously have been kind of the work of a guy, this person or that person. Parker actually put together a committee, although not as fully formed as it should have been. And it was particularly weak in the Old Testament. It was only as good as the individual translators, which tended to be one of the bishops. Although Parker does an interesting thing. He makes each individual writer, translator, put his initials at the end of each book of the Bible that he translates so they can be held accountable for their work, which is why some of them tended to be really slow getting their work done. The Bishop's Bible forms the basis of the King James Bible. When James comes to power and authorizes the King James Bible to be produced, what he asked for basically was a revision of the Bishop's Bible. Each member of the translation committee of the King James was given a loose leaf copy of the Bishop's Bible. And their instructions were to stray as little as possible from the Bishop's Bible. But they knew it had to be corrected. I liken it to this. Remember after the American Revolution, the Americans win and you have the United States of America was formed. And the United States of America was organized under a constitution called the Articles of the Confederation. and it wasn't working. And the Constitutional Convention was called to modify the Articles of the Confederation to make this thing work, because you had New York and New Jersey going to war against each other. It was kind of a mess. And you remember the story, the members of the Constitutional Convention come together and they look at the Articles of the Confederation and say, well, we can't fix this. It's hopeless. And so they went to work secretly creating a new document, what is now the American Constitution. You remember Patrick Henry refused to go to the Constitutional Convention, and he issued the famous statement, "I smell a rat." And the King James Bible translators really parallel that, because they are called together to modify the bishop's Bible, to update it, to modify it, to bring the English up to date. And they start working and they realize this is hopeless. There is no fixing the bishop's Bible. And so they lay their mandate aside. They kind of give lip service, yeah, we're adjusting the bishop's Bible, but what they really do is create an entire new translation. And so that's kind of my parallel. You get the Constitution, the American Constitution, which lasts to this day, and you get the King James Version of the Bible as a new document which dominates the English church and the English-speaking world for the next 400 years.